When Marcus Chen's biomonitor flatlined in Watson District, trauma team took exactly 4 minutes to arrive. By corporate policy, he was already dead. The armored AV screamed overhead, rotors slicing through neon-stained rain that fell in sheets across the alley. Marcus lay sprawled between dumpsters overflowing with synthetic waste. 3 bullets lodged in his chest cavity, blood pooling beneath him in chromatic swirls that reflected advertisement holograms flickering on the wet concrete. His vision stuttered. Digital artifacts corrupted his field of view. The Kiroshi optics installed in his skull were glitching, failing, drowning in the same blood that was draining his consciousness. Life was leaving him in measured increments, each heartbeat weaker than the last. He heard boots then, heavy tactical footwear hitting pavement with mechanical precision. Professional, unhurried. The sound grew closer, then stopped. The trauma team medic stood over Marcus's body without kneeling. The man's armor was pristine white with red crosses that seemed to glow in the darkness, spotless despite the filth of Watson's back alleys. He checked his wrist-mounted display with the casual efficiency of someone reviewing a shopping list. Marcus's insurance information materialized on the screen in cold blue light. Silver tier coverage. Monthly premium of €500. Response time guarantee clearly stated as 3 minutes maximum from biomonitor alert to physical arrival at scene. Current elapsed time showed 4 minutes and 18 seconds. The medic tapped his comlink without emotion. His voice carried the clinical detachment of someone who'd made this call 1,000 times before. Like he was ordering synthetic coffee. Like Marcus wasn't bleeding out at his feet. Platinum client 2 blocks north. Cardiac event. Rerouting now. A pause. Brief. Calculated. This one's expired coverage. Log it as response delay due to atmospheric conditions. Marcus's failing neural implants caught fragments of sound before complete system shutdown threatened. The AV's engines cycling back to full power. Hydraulic landing gear retracting with pneumatic hisses. Rain drumming against armored hull plating. The wash of rotor downforce pushing his blood in ripples across the alley floor. They were leaving. They were actually leaving him to die. The sound of the AV faded into Night City's perpetual mechanical thunder. Marcus tried to move, tried to call out, but his vocal cords wouldn't respond. His augmented spine was sending error messages directly into his brainstem. System failure cascading through every piece of chrome installed in his body. The cheap Zetatech implants were shutting down in sequence, prioritizing his vital systems, trying desperately to keep him alive, even as his insurance company had decided he wasn't worth the effort. He didn't die immediately. The human body, even one modified with bottom-tier cyberware, possesses a resilience that defies easy categorization. Marcus Chen's consciousness clung to existence with desperate biological determination. His Kiroshi cyber optics continued recording everything with mechanical precision even as his organic vision dimmed. Timestamp data. GPS coordinates accurate to within centimeters. Biometric readings cascading steadily toward zero. Heart rate dropping. Blood pressure critical. Core temperature falling. All of it uploaded automatically to trauma team servers. Documentation for their legal department. Proof they'd responded within acceptable parameters given the circumstances. Evidence that Marcus Chen's death was not their liability. Somewhere in Arasaka Tower, buried deep in server farms that hummed with quantum processing power, an algorithm received Marcus's medical data. It took exactly 11 seconds to process his entire existence. The system was elegant in its efficiency. It evaluated Marcus Chen against 17,000 discrete data points collected over his 32 years of life. Employment history showed 8 years with Zetatech's manufacturing division in Watson. No promotions. No commendations. Standard assembly line work installing optical components for consumer-grade cyberware. His credit score hovered at a dismal 482, dragged down by missed payments and maxed-out lines of credit. Monthly income averaged €3,847 before taxes. After mandatory deductions for corporate housing, food vouchers, and equipment rental fees, his take-home pay was barely 2,100 eddies. The algorithm noted his outstanding medical debt, €47,000 from a botched Chrome installation 2 years prior. Street Ripper Doc and Kabuki had promised him military-grade spinal augmentation at civilian prices. What Marcus got instead was an infection that nearly killed him, nerve damage that required 3 corrective surgeries, and debt that would follow him until death, which, the algorithm calculated, would be very soon. His organs were catalogued with clinical precision. Liver showed early-stage cirrhosis from years of cheap synthetic alcohol. Kidney function was compromised. Filtration efficiency down to 73%. Lungs displayed scarring from Watson's toxic atmosphere. Particulate damage consistent with a decade of breathing unfiltered air in the industrial sector. His heart was strong, surprisingly so. But the bullets had damaged the left ventricle beyond field repair. The algorithm processed this information against current market values, against corporate insurance tables, against projected medical costs versus potential economic output if he survived. Final determination: Marcus Chen's economic value was negative €28,144. Status: not viable for resource allocation. His file received a red flag in every corporate database in Night City. The kind of flag that told megacorps and insurance providers and medical facilities that Marcus Chen wasn't worth saving. The kind of flag that meant doors would close when he approached, that emergency rooms would suddenly be at capacity, that job applications would be rejected without review. The kind of flag that was effectively a death sentence. But Marcus Chen didn't die in that alley. He should have. By every medical standard, by every statistical model embedded in Night City's vast network of predictive algorithms, his body should have surrendered to hemorrhagic shock within 7 minutes of the shooting. The bullets had torn through major blood vessels. His augmented spine was sparking, sending random electrical pulses through his nervous system. His lungs were filling with blood that his damaged heart couldn't properly circulate. Yet something kept him breathing. Something kept his heart stuttering irregularly against his ribs, pumping what little blood remained through his system. Something kept his neural implants firing, even as blood pressure dropped to levels that should have caused immediate brain death. Later, the doctors who examined what remained of him would have no explanation. They'd call it an anomaly, a statistical outlier, the kind of medical impossibility that happened once in 10 million cases. Marcus just called it cruel, because staying alive meant he was still conscious when the scavengers found him 43 minutes later. They came in a rusted panel van with no identifying marks, license plates obscured by strategic grime. 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all wearing mismatched tactical gear and respirators that filtered Watson's poisoned air. They moved with practiced efficiency like factory workers on an assembly line, because that's essentially what they were. Factory workers processing human raw materials. The woman checked Marcus's pulse with fingers covered in cracked synth leather gloves. "He's still alive," she said, voice muffled through her respirator. No surprise in her tone, no concern, just stating a fact. "Biosigns are weak but stable." "Lucky bastard." One of the men laughed. The sound was harsh, metallic through his vocoder. "Lucky? We're about to make him unlucky." They loaded Marcus into the van like cargo. No gentleness, no care for his injuries. His body screamed with pain as they lifted him, bullets grinding against shattered ribs, blood loss making his vision tunnel into gray static. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but no sound emerged. His vocal augmentation had finally failed completely. The van's interior reeked of disinfectant layered over older, more organic smells. Chemical cleaners couldn't quite mask the copper scent of blood or the sweet rot of infected tissue. Cargo straps held Marcus in place on a metal table welded directly to the floor. Rust stains formed abstract patterns on the walls. Stains that might have been rust, might have been something else. The woman pulled out a handheld medical scanner. Ancient technology, at least a decade old, screen cracked and held together with synthetic tape. She ran it over Marcus's body from head to toe while the van lurched into motion. The scanner beeped softly with each pass, cataloging his augments, measuring organ viability, calculating resale value. "Spine's fried," she announced. "Kiroshi optics are consumer grade, maybe worth 500 eddies to a fence. Lungs are scarred but still functional. Kidneys compromised but salvageable. Liver's damaged but has regenerative capacity. Heart strong despite the bullets." She paused, studying the readout. Left arm's got decent myomer muscle replacement. Right leg has enhanced joint servos. Both are worth pulling. Marcus's consciousness processed this information with dreamlike horror. They were inventorying him, deciding which parts of his body were worth stealing. Which pieces of Marcus Chen could be sold for profit? The male scavenger with the vocoder leaned over him. Eyes were cold behind scratched ballistic goggles. "Don't worry, friend. We'll patch you up after. Drop you somewhere you can get help." His tone suggested this was a lie. Suggested they both knew it was a lie. Suggested he didn't care that Marcus knew. The woman prepared an injection. Clear liquid in a cracked syringe. "Local anesthetic. We don't want you dying from shock before we're finished." Marcus felt the needle punch through synth skin into his remaining flesh. Felt cold spread through his veins. But the drug wasn't enough. Wasn't nearly enough. When they started cutting, when the molecular saw began removing his left arm at the elbow, when the extraction tool drilled into his abdomen to access his kidneys, he felt every second. He felt everything, and he couldn't even scream. The procedure took 97 minutes. When they were finished, Marcus Chen wasn't dead. That would have been merciful. Instead, he existed in a state between life and death that had no proper medical classification. His left arm terminated at the elbow, the stump wrapped in cheap synth skin that was already beginning to reject. His right leg ended mid-thigh, hastily cauterized and sealed. Both kidneys were gone, leaving a drainage tube that emptied into a collection bag. Sections of his liver had been removed with surgical precision. Portions of his lungs extracted through his back. The incisions sealed with industrial adhesive. They'd taken everything with resale value and left him with the absolute minimum required to technically remain alive. The scavengers dumped him outside a free clinic in Kabuki at 3:47 a.m. They didn't even slow down completely, just opened the van's rear door and shoved his body onto the wet pavement. Marcus hit the ground and felt something tear inside him. Something important. The drainage tube disconnected, spilling his bodily fluids across the street. He lay there for 17 minutes before someone noticed. The free clinic operated out of what used to be a ramen shop, the neon sign still visible through layers of grime on the windows. Inside, the space was cramped and overcrowded and reeked of human suffering, inadequately masked by chemical cleaners. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, several already burned out, casting shadows across examination tables where people waited with injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic. A nurse found Marcus on the street. She was young, maybe 25, with budget cyber optics that gave her eyes an unsettling reflective quality in the dim light. She'd seen this before, seen it dozens of times. Scav victims dumped outside like trash, their bodies harvested and discarded. She didn't look surprised, didn't look horrified. She just looked tired. "We got another one," she called into the clinic, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Partial harvest, still alive somehow. Need a gurney." They brought Marcus inside. The examination table was cracked vinyl over padding that had compressed into concrete hardness from years of use. The overhead light flickered constantly, making everything seem like it was moving in stop motion. Around him, other patients moaned or cried or sat in silent shock. A man with his face half melted from acid burns. A woman missing both legs below the knee. A teenager with deep lacerations across his torso that exposed synthetic muscle fiber. Watson's casualties. Night City's expendables. The clinic's intake nurse materialized beside Marcus's table. She was older, maybe 50, with dead eyes and cheaper chrome than the implants that had been stolen from his body. Decades of witnessing human misery had burned away whatever empathy she might have once possessed. She held a datapad, like it was a weapon. "Sign here for life-saving intervention," she said, her voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. Pure bureaucratic efficiency. Total charges come to €18,400. That includes emergency stabilization, synthetic organ replacement, infection prophylaxis, and recovery monitoring. Payment plans available at 24% annual interest. Marcus stared at the number through vision that kept fading to static. His remaining cyber optic was struggling, damaged by whatever the scavengers had done during extraction. 18,000 eddies. His monthly salary wouldn't cover the interest alone. The interest on the interest would bury him. I don't... His voice emerged as a wet rasp, damaged vocal cords struggling to form words. I can't pay that. I don't have... The nurse's expression didn't change. She'd heard this exact sentence thousands of times. Heard it from every victim the scavengers dragged through their doors. Her response was practiced, memorized, delivered with the emotional investment of a pre-recorded message. Then you're free to leave, right now. But the implants keeping you alive come out at the door. She gestured at his torso. Biomonitor maintaining your blood pressure. Circulation pump compensating for missing kidneys. Lung regulator handling respiration. All clinic property until the bill is paid in full. She meant it. Marcus could see the absolute certainty in her dead eyes. If he refused to sign, if he tried to leave without paying, they would remove the temporary implants sustaining his life and let him die on the street. It was perfectly legal. He'd received life-saving emergency care. Under Night City corporate law, medical providers had the right to repossess their equipment from non-paying patients. The equipment keeping him alive. Marcus's remaining hand shook as he pressed his thumb to the datapad's biometric scanner. The screen flashed green. Contract accepted. Debt registered. His financial ruin was now legally documented and enforced by the full power of Night City's corporate legal system. The nurse pulled the datapad away without a word and disappeared into the crowded clinic. Somewhere in Arasaka Tower, the algorithm that had already sentenced Marcus to death noted the new transaction. His file updated automatically. New debt, new obligations, new calculations. His economic value recalculated at negative €46,944 and falling. Within 30 seconds, 3 corporations had bid on his labor contract. That's when Marcus Chen learned the fundamental truth about Night City. About the megacorporations that owned every street, every building, every breath of polluted air. They didn't decide who lived or died with malice or hatred or even anger. They made those decisions with spreadsheets, with algorithms, with the cold mathematics of profit margins and cost-benefit analysis. Your life had value only as long as you were profitable. The moment you became a liability, the moment your existence cost more than it contributed, you were worth less than the sum of your parts, and someone would definitely calculate the value of your parts. Marcus spent 2 days in the clinic's recovery area, which was actually just a hallway lined with fold-out cots where patients were monitored until they were stable enough to be released. Or died, whichever came first. The temporary implants in his chest hummed constantly. Synthetic organs doing the work his organic systems could no longer perform. Every hour someone checked his vitals and marked them on a chart. No one spoke to him. No one offered comfort or explanation or hope. On the 3rd day, the intake nurse returned with another datapad. Your debt has been purchased, she said without preamble. Biotechnica acquired your labor contract this morning. They've covered your medical expenses in exchange for 5 years of mandatory employment. You report to their Chuge 2 processing facility in Northside at 600 tomorrow. She handed him a chip containing his contract details, his new ID badge, and directions to the facility. Don't be late. Contract stipulates they can add penalty time for failure to report. Then she was gone. Marcus lay on the cot and understood with perfect clarity what had just happened. Biotechnica hadn't saved him out of compassion. They'd identified him as an available resource and acquired him for less than market value. His debt made him desperate. Desperate people accepted conditions that others wouldn't. The scavenger harvest meant he couldn't do physically demanding work, which meant he was only suitable for the most toxic, dangerous, soul-crushing jobs that other workers avoided. Jobs that would kill him slowly enough to extract 5 years of labor first. The contract was 12 pages of dense legal language, but the essential terms were straightforward. 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, no overtime pay, monthly wage of €2,400 before deductions, after debt repayment, equipment rental, corporate housing fees, and mandatory insurance premiums. His take-home pay would be approximately 340 eddies per month. Enough for nutritional kibble and a closet-sized apartment in corporate housing where the walls leaked chemical runoff and the water came out brown. The contract also stipulated that in the event of workplace death, all viable organs would become Biotechnica property. They'd already calculated the salvage value of his body, already determined that even dead, he was worth something to them. Standard clause. No one read the fine print anymore because everyone knew what it said. You belong to the corporation in life. They owned your labor, your time, your health, your future. And when life finally surrendered, when your body collapsed under the weight of their exploitation, you belonged to them in death too. Your organs would be harvested, catalogued, and sold. Your remaining possessions would be seized to cover final expenses. Your corpse would be cremated in bulk processing facilities where bodies were reduced to ash by the dozens. And somewhere in Arasaka Tower, the algorithm would update your file one final time. Status: asset liquidated. Value extracted. Complete. Marcus reported to Biotechnica's facility the next morning at precisely 0600 hours. The building was a massive industrial structure in Northside, all corrugated metal and reinforced concrete, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire and electrified deterrent systems. Guard towers at each corner held automated turrets that tracked movement with mechanical precision. Signs warned that deadly force was authorized against trespassers. Inside, the air tasted like chemicals, like burning plastic and synthetic fuel and something organic that shouldn't be organic. The facility processed CHU-H2, the synthetic grain alcohol fuel that powered every vehicle and generator in Night City. The process was toxic, corrosive, carcinogenic. The exposure limits were carefully calculated guidelines designed to maximize productivity while minimizing immediate death. Long-term death was acceptable, expected, budgeted for. The facility supervisor was a woman named Kowalski. She had more chrome than flesh. Her body replaced piece by piece until she was more machine than human. Her eyes were pure black optical sensors that tracked Marcus like targeting systems, analyzing and measuring and finding him insufficient. "Chen, Marcus," she said, reading from her wrist display. "Debt ratio 1.9. Medical restrictions for heavy labor. Physical limitations due to scav harvest." She looked up at him with those expressionless black eyes. "You're assigned to Section 7. Coolant reclamation." She handed him a respirator that looked like it had been manufactured before he was born. The seals were cracked. The filters were brown with accumulated particulate. Regulations required workers be provided with respiratory protection. They didn't require the protection to be functional. "Shift starts in 5 minutes. Don't be late." Section 7 was where they sent people who didn't matter. The expendables. The disposable. Workers whose deaths would cost less than their continued employment. Marcus understood this the moment he walked through the heavy steel door and felt the air change. It was thicker here, denser. Each breath required conscious effort, like inhaling syrup. The coolant they reclaimed was partially radioactive, carcinogenic, mutagenic, and corrosive. The exposure limits posted on the wall were recommendations, not requirements. Biotechnica had calculated the profit margins carefully. 6 months of extracting labor from damaged workers versus the wrongful death payout in the unlikely event someone sued. The math always favored killing them slowly. There were 11 other workers in Section 7. None of them looked at Marcus when he entered. None of them spoke. They moved through the chemical fog like ghosts, performing their tasks with mechanical repetition, faces obscured by respirators that didn't quite seal properly. Some had visible tumors beneath their skin. Others coughed blood into recycled air filters that should have been replaced weeks ago. One man's arms ended in crude mechanical claws because he'd sold his hands to pay medical debt, then returned to work because stopping meant dying faster. Marcus joined the assembly line. The work was simple, brutally, monotonously simple. Coolant flowed through pipes from the CHU-H2 processors. His job was to monitor flow rates, check for contamination, and manually valve off sections when pressure exceeded safe limits. Except there were no safe limits. The coolant was always contaminated. The pressure always exceeded specifications. His job was to pretend the system was functioning correctly while it slowly poisoned him. After his first hour, Marcus felt the burning in his remaining lung tissue. After 3 hours, he was coughing. After 6 hours, he tasted metal. By the end of his 12-hour shift, his vision was blurring at the edges and his hands shook with tremors he couldn't control. The supervisor checked his output without looking at him. Acceptable performance. Report tomorrow at 0600. Marcus stumbled out of Section 7 and found the facility's medical station. It occupied a corner of the break room, staffed by a medtech with expired certification and a pharmaceutical printer that dispensed only generics. The sign above the small desk read, "Minor injuries only. Major trauma requires off-site insurance." The medtech was young, mid-20s, with cheap Kiroshi optics and an expression that suggested he'd already given up on life. He looked up from his terminal with obvious reluctance. "What do you need?" Marcus coughed, felt something wet and warm in his throat. "I'm developing respiratory problems. The coolant in Section 7... The medtech didn't let him finish. Didn't examine him. Just pulled up Marcus's file on a cracked screen that flickered with every touch. "Your contract includes basic workplace medical coverage. That covers lacerations, contusions, acute chemical poisoning requiring immediate intervention. Chronic exposure isn't covered." He gestured vaguely at Marcus's chest without actually looking at him. "Lung degradation from coolant exposure is classified as pre-existing condition. You came to us already damaged from scav harvest. The damage is happening now, here, today. This facility is pre-existing," the medtech repeated. His tone made clear this wasn't a conversation. This was policy being recited. Biotechnica's liability begins and ends with acute workplace injuries requiring immediate life-saving intervention. Everything else falls under your personal health insurance, which, according to your file, you don't have. Marcus felt something crystallize in his chest. Understanding. Cold and perfect and devastating. They'd calculated this. All of it. Knew the coolant would destroy his remaining lung tissue. Knew he'd develop progressive respiratory failure within a year. But by corporate definition, it wasn't their responsibility. He'd entered their employment already compromised by scav harvest. The lung damage would be classified as consequential to prior trauma, not workplace exposure. No liability, no compensation, no problem, just profit. Marcus worked Section 7 for 3 months. 93 days of breathing poison, of feeling his body deteriorate in increments, of coughing blood into filters that turned from white to red to brown to black. The tumors started in his second month, small lumps beneath his skin that grew steadily larger. The tremors in his hands became constant. His vision degraded as the toxic exposure damaged his optic nerve. The other workers fell one by one. The woman with tumors collapsed during shift and died before the medtech arrived. The man with mechanical claws lost function in his augments and was terminated for inability to meet productivity standards. New workers arrived to replace them. All damaged, all desperate, all already dying. Section 7 was a machine that converted human life into corporate profit, and Marcus Chen was just fuel for that machine. On the 74th day, his productivity dropped below minimum standards. The coughing had become so severe he couldn't focus on his tasks. His hands shook too much to manipulate the valves properly. He made mistakes. Small ones at first, then larger. Supervisor Kowalski called him into her office. The room was small, sterile, dominated by a desk with 3 monitors displaying real-time data from every section of the facility. Kowalski sat behind that desk with her black optical eyes that saw everything and felt nothing. She didn't gesture for Marcus to sit. There were no chairs for workers in her office. "Your efficiency dropped 14% this month," she said without preamble. "Contract stipulates minimum productivity standards must be maintained. You're currently below threshold." Marcus tried to control his breathing. Felt his remaining lungs struggle against tissue damage that was rapidly becoming catastrophic. The exposure, the chemicals. "I need medical intervention. I need..." "Medical expenses beyond basic coverage are your responsibility," Kowalski interrupted. She pulled up a document on her center screen, turned it toward him. "However, Biotechnica is prepared to offer you a solution. We have a program for employees experiencing declining health that affects their productive capacity." The document header read, "Voluntary Organ Donation Program. Enhanced Final Compensation Package." Marcus read it again. The words didn't change. Biotechnica wanted him to sign over his viable organs now, while he was still alive, to schedule his own execution, to make his death legal and profitable for all parties involved. In exchange, they'd provide end-of-life care in a clean medical facility and pay out €20,000 to his designated beneficiary. More than enough to settle his remaining debt with money left over. What if I refuse? Marcus's voice was barely audible. He already knew the answer. Kowalski's expression didn't change. Those black eyes reflected his image back at him like mirrors. Then you're terminated for breach of contract. Your debt goes to collections. Your remaining assets are seized. Corporate housing access revoked immediately. You'll be on the street with no income, no shelter, no medical access. She paused precisely long enough for the implications to sink in. Voluntary donation guarantees your designated beneficiary receives the full payout. Termination guarantees they receive nothing. And you die anyway. Marcus had a sister, Maria, 3 years younger. She worked sanitation in Japantown, barely surviving on that income. Living in a closet apartment with 6 other people, eating kibble and dreaming of something better that would never come. 20,000 eddies would change her life, would give her a chance, would mean his death had purpose, would mean he mattered. His hand shook as he pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner. Contract accepted. The algorithm in Arasaka Tower noted the transaction immediately. Marcus Chen's file updated. Status: voluntary organ donation scheduled in 14 days. His organs were already listed on Biotechnica's internal medical exchange, cataloged and priced. Liver damaged but with regenerative capacity, viable for emergency transplant. Single remaining kidney in acceptable condition. Lungs compromised but usable for salvage. Heart still strong despite chronic toxic exposure. Total projected revenue from harvest: €64,000. After operational expenses, Biotechnica would net approximately 39,000 eddies. The 20,000 payout to Marcus's sister was already calculated as marketing expense. Corporate social responsibility. Proof that Biotechnica cared about their workers. Good publicity was worth the cost. Marcus spent his remaining 2 weeks working Section 7. The other workers knew. They always knew. Word spread through the facility's underground communication networks. Some nodded at him in acknowledgement. Others looked away quickly. He'd made the smart choice. The kind choice. The only choice. At least his death would benefit someone. At least he'd die clean. On his final day, Marcus didn't report to Section 7. He walked instead to Biotechnica's medical center, a separate building on the facility campus that gleamed with expensive cleanliness. Chrome and glass and sterile surfaces. They treated donors well here, made the process comfortable. It was in the company's interest to maintain product quality. The intake nurse was different from the free clinic in Kabuki. This one smiled. Her chrome was expensive, subtle, designed to enhance rather than replace. She wore actual designer clothing instead of corporate coveralls. "Mr. Chen," she said warmly. Practiced warmth. Professional warmth. "We've been expecting you. If you'll follow me, we'll get you prepped for the procedure." She led him through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and artificial flowers. Past other donors in various stages of preparation. Past viewing windows where surgeons in clean suits calibrated extraction equipment. Past refrigeration units where organs waited in preservation solution, tagged and inventoried like products on a shelf. Past all evidence that this was an industrial operation dressed in medical aesthetics. The preparation room was almost comfortable. Reclined chair that molded to his body. Soft lighting that didn't flicker. They even offered him real coffee. Not synthetic. Actual coffee made from genuine beans. Marcus hadn't tasted real coffee in 5 years. It was delicious. Cruelly delicious. The anesthesiologist entered quietly. Middle-aged man with kind eyes and steady hands. He'd done this hundreds of times. Maybe thousands. He prepared the IV with practiced efficiency. "You'll go to sleep," he said gently. "You won't feel any pain. You won't feel anything at all." He paused, searching for words. "When you wake up, you won't wake up. But I promise it will be peaceful. Painless." Marcus nodded. He'd accepted this. Made his peace. His sister would receive the money, would have a chance. That was enough. Your designated beneficiary will receive the full payout within 48 hours, the anesthesiologist continued. Biotechnica guarantees all benefits. Your sacrifice matters, Mr. Chen. You're helping people, saving lives. The words were supposed to be comforting. They just made Marcus feel hollow. They placed the IV in his arm. Marcus felt the coldness spread up his vein, into his shoulder, across his chest. His vision softened at the edges. The anesthesiologist's face became distant, swimming in and out of focus. Count backwards from 10 for me. Marcus made it to 7 before the darkness took him completely. But his story didn't end in that room. Because 3 hours into the extraction procedure, while surgeons worked with mechanical efficiency to harvest his organs, a priority medical alert hit Biotechnica's medical system. Emergency notification. Maximum urgency. A platinum-tier client in Westbrook had suffered massive trauma in a corporate assassination attempt. Arasaka executive. High level. Critical condition. Multiple organ failure. Needed immediate kidney transplant or death would occur within the hour. The lead surgeon paused mid-extraction, checked his comm, read the message twice, looked at the kidney sitting in the sterile basin beside Marcus's opened body. Marcus Chen's kidney. Healthy. Viable. Perfect tissue match. That kidney was already allocated, scheduled for delivery to a hospital in Santo Domingo for a transplant patient waiting there. Lower priority, silver tier insurance, surgery scheduled for next week. The surgeon looked at his assistant. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. They both understood the hierarchy. Both knew the rules. Platinum trumped everything. The surgeon tapped his comm. Redirect Chen's kidney to Westbrook Medical immediately. Prep for emergency transport. What about the Santo Domingo patient? His assistant asked. The surgeon was already moving. Didn't pause. Log it as unexpected tissue rejection. They'll find another donor. Except they wouldn't. Kidneys matching that patient's profile came available perhaps once every 3 months. The next one wouldn't arrive in time. The Santo Domingo patient died 2 days later while still waiting. Died believing his transplant had simply been delayed by medical complications. His family received a brief notification. Surgical complications. No further explanation. His silver tier insurance didn't cover escalated care or alternative treatments. The hospital expressed their condolences and presented his widow with the final bill. $58,000 for the privilege of watching her husband die slowly. The Arasaka executive lived, received Marcus Chen's kidney along with portions of his liver, returned to work within a month, never knew the origin of his new organs, never thought about the system that had valued his life over dozens of others, never questioned why organs appeared exactly when he needed them. He was platinum tier. That's all that mattered. That's all that ever mattered. Marcus Chen's organs saved 4 people that day, generated €64,000 in revenue for Biotechnica. His sister Maria received the $20,000 payout as promised. She cried when the notification arrived, cried from relief and grief and guilt, used half the money to pay down her own crushing medical debt, used the rest for 3 months of better nutrition, new clothing without holes, a security deposit on a slightly larger apartment with heat that actually worked. 3 months later, she was back in debt, back in the same trap. The cycle continued. Because 20,000 eddies doesn't change anything in Night City. Not really. It just buys you time. A brief respite. A moment to breathe before the system crushes you again. The megacorporations don't hate you. They don't even think about you. You're just numbers in a database. Resources to be extracted. Problems to be solved with algorithms and cost-benefit analysis. Marcus Chen was just one name in a database of millions. One worker among thousands processed through Section 7. One donor among hundreds who'd signed the voluntary program. His death was efficient, profitable, necessary for the system to function. And the system functioned perfectly. Trauma team averaged 47 response calls daily in Watson District alone. 32 were platinum clients. 12 were gold tier. 3 were silver. Every time a platinum call came through, lower tier clients waited. Bled out, died. Company policy, contractually protected, completely legal. 7 minutes or your money back, unless you weren't worth saving. Biotechnica processed 300 workers monthly through Section 7. 90% developed chronic conditions within 6 months. 60% enrolled in the voluntary donation program within a year. The organ donation division exceeded 282 profits by 17%. The voluntary program was their most successful revenue stream. Militech sold weapons to corporate security forces throughout Night City. Those weapons killed civilians in crossfire incidents daily. The civilians had no legal recourse. Corporate immunity. Militech's contracts included liability waivers for collateral damage. Every bullet was manufactured with calculated acceptable casualties. Every magazine held quantified human worth. Arasaka's algorithms processed billions of data points hourly, measuring economic value, predicting failures, identifying resources. Every person in Night City had been evaluated, categorized, assigned worth. The algorithms decided who received medical care, who qualified for corporate housing, who was worth investing in, and who should be allowed to die. The decisions weren't personal, weren't cruel, just mathematical. Night City ran on death, not the violent, dramatic death shown in brain-dance entertainment. The quiet death, the statistical death, the death that happened in clinics and processing facilities and back alleys when trauma team decided you weren't worth the response time. Marcus Chen was just one number in a spreadsheet of millions. His death was profitable, efficient, necessary, and somewhere in Arasaka Tower, in server rooms that hummed with quantum processing power, the algorithms continued their eternal calculations, measuring lives, weighing worth, deciding fates with mathematical precision. The system didn't need to be cruel, it just needed to be profitable. That was enough. Maria Chen received the notification at 4:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was 3 hours into her shift when her personal comm vibrated. The message was brief, clinical, devoid of humanity. Payment received, €20,000. Source, Biotechnica Voluntary Donation Program. Donor, Marcus Chen. Our condolences. She stood in the maintenance tunnel beneath Japantown, waste management equipment humming around her, and felt her world collapse. The comm display blurred. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the device into the chemical runoff flowing past her boots. Marcus was dead. Her brother, who'd raised her after their parents died in the Unification War, who'd worked himself into disability to pay her medical bills when she'd gotten sick at 15, who'd sent her every spare eddy he could scrape together, even when he was drowning in his own debt. Dead. Voluntarily donated. Maria knew what those words meant. Everyone in Night City knew. Voluntary donation was what happened when corporations convinced you that your death had more value than your life, when they made dying seem like kindness. She accessed the account. 20,000 eddies. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. Blood money. The monetized remains of her brother's body. Around her, the maintenance tunnel continued its perpetual operation. Water treatment systems processing Watson's toxic waste. Chemical filters straining out particulates. Automated systems maintaining the infrastructure that kept the megacorps running while people like Marcus died to feed them. Maria made a decision in that moment. She wasn't going to let his death be meaningless. The first thing Maria did was quit her job, walked out of that maintenance tunnel, and never returned. The supervisor called her comm 47 times over the next 3 hours. She blocked the number. Her employment contract had penalty clauses for breach of terms, but she didn't care. Let them sue. Let them try to collect. She had 20,000 eddies now. Enough to hire a lawyer. Enough to fight. The second thing she did was research. Maria spent 3 days in net cafes across Kabuki, using anonymous terminals to dig through corporate databases. She wasn't a net runner. Didn't have the chrome or the skills for deep dives. But she didn't need to hack classified systems. The information she wanted was public, hidden in plain sight, buried in financial reports and medical journals and legal filings that no one bothered to read. She found Biotechnica's voluntary donation statistics. 300 workers annually from the Northside facility alone. 64% from Section 7 specifically. Average time from employment to donation, 7 months. She found trauma teams' response data. Platinum clients averaged 2.3-minute response times. Gold clients averaged 4.1 minutes. Silver clients averaged 8.7 minutes. But those were just the clients they actually reached. The data didn't include abandoned responses, cases where lower-tier clients were left to die because higher priority calls came through. The data also didn't include people like Marcus, people whose biomonitors triggered, but whose insurance had technically expired by the time trauma team arrived. Those cases were classified as non-viable responses and excluded from official statistics. Clever, legal, monstrous. She found the organ market data. Black market organs averaged 12,000 eddies per kidney. Legal corporate organs through voluntary donation programs, 32,000 eddies per kidney. Livers ranged from 45,000 to 78,000, depending on condition. Hearts could reach 120,000 for perfect specimens. Marcus's body had generated at least 64,000 eddies for Biotechnica. They'd paid his sister 20,000, netted 44,000 in profit. Plus, they'd eliminated a worker who'd become economically non-viable, cleared his debt from their books, freed up his position for a fresh, desperate victim. Perfect efficiency. Maria compiled everything into a single document. 37 pages of data, charts, graphs, statistics, testimonials from families of other voluntary donors, medical reports showing the direct correlation between Section 7 exposure and organ failure, evidence. Then she made copies, dozens of them, encrypted them, distributed them across the net in hidden repositories. Insurance. Because she knew what happened to people who threatened corporate interests. They disappeared. On the fourth day, Maria walked into the offices of World News Service in City Center. WNS was one of the few remaining independent media corporations in Night City. Independent was relative. They still had corporate sponsors, still had advertisers to please, still operated within the boundaries of what the megacorps would tolerate. But they had a reputation for occasionally running stories that other outlets wouldn't touch. Stories that made people uncomfortable. The receptionist was a young woman with holographic nails that cycled through advertising displays. She looked up from her terminal with practiced disinterest. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Maria said. "But I have a story about Biotechnica killing workers for organs. I have proof." The receptionist's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Interest. Or maybe concern. She tapped her comm. "There's someone here about Biotechnica. Says she has documentation." A pause. She looked serious. 2 minutes later, Maria was sitting across from a journalist named Sarah Kowalski. Mid-30s, expensive chrome, designer clothing that suggested WNS paid better than most outlets. Her office had windows overlooking City Center's Corpo Plaza. Real windows, not screens. Kowalski listened to Maria's story without interrupting, reviewed the documentation on her personal terminal. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but her fingers moved faster as she scrolled through the data. "This is substantial," Kowalski finally said. "If it's accurate, this is evidence of systematic exploitation resulting in wrongful death." "It's accurate," Maria replied. "My brother died in their program. So have hundreds of others." Kowalski leaned back in her chair. The leather creaked softly. "Ms. Chen, I need to be honest with you. Biotechnica is one of WNS's largest advertisers. They spend approximately 8 million eddies annually on our platforms. If we run this story, we lose that revenue." Maria felt hope dying. "So you won't—" "I didn't say that." Kowalski's expression hardened. "I said we'd lose revenue. I didn't say we wouldn't run it." She pulled up another screen. 6 months ago, my cousin died in an Arasaka black site. Corporate security picked him up for suspected data theft. No trial, no charges, just disappeared. 3 weeks later, we got notification of his death. Suicide, they said. Except my cousin was terrified of heights, and they claimed he jumped from a building. She turned the screen toward Maria. It showed a young man's face, smiling, alive. "The system protects itself," Kowalski continued. "But sometimes, when we're smart about it, we can make people see. We can't bring down Biotechnica, can't destroy Arasaka, but we can make their practices public, make them uncomfortable, force them to change the most egregious policies or face consumer backlash." "Will it matter?" Maria asked. "Will anything actually change?" Kowalski smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. "Probably not, but we try anyway. Because the alternative is accepting that this is how things have to be. The story ran 3 days later. Not on WNS's main feed. That would have been suicide. Instead, it appeared on their investigative journalism channel. Smaller audience, lower visibility, plausible deniability for the corporation. The headline read, "The Hidden Cost of Voluntary Donation. How Megacorps Profit from Worker Deaths." Within 6 hours, it had been viewed 2.3 million times. Within 12 hours, Biotechnica's legal department had filed an injunction to remove the content. Defamation, trade libel, theft of proprietary information. They cited 17 different statutes and demanded €50 million in damages. Within 18 hours, the story had been copied, reposted, and distributed across thousands of independent net channels. The original might disappear, but the information was out there now, spreading like a virus through Night City's digital infrastructure. People started paying attention. Not everyone. Most people in Night City were too busy surviving to care about corporate exploitation they already assumed was happening. But some people cared. Families of other voluntary donors started coming forward. Workers from Section 7 who'd quit before reaching the donation stage shared their stories. Medical professionals leaked internal documents showing that corporations like Biotechnica specifically hired workers with pre-existing conditions because they could be exploited more efficiently. The pattern became undeniable. Biotechnica issued a statement. Professional, carefully worded. Their voluntary donation program was entirely legal, they said. Participants were fully informed of all terms. Medical care exceeded industry standards. The program provided dying workers with dignity and ensured their families received financial compensation. They didn't address the exposure data. Didn't explain why Section 7 workers had a 64% enrollment rate. Didn't mention that their own policies classified lung damage from toxic exposure as pre-existing conditions. The net exploded with commentary. Some defended Biotechnica, praised the donation program as humane, insisted that workers entered voluntarily and benefited from the arrangement. These voices were loud, persistent, and often posted from accounts that had been created within the last 48 hours. Corporate astroturfing, manufacturing consent. But other voices pushed back. Families sharing stories. Workers exposing conditions. Independent analysts breaking down the profit margins. The narrative was shifting. Slowly, incrementally, but shifting. Maria watched it all from a rented apartment in Haywood. She'd used some of Marcus's money to disappear, changed her identity documentation, bought basic security chrome to make tracking harder. She wasn't naive enough to think she was safe. Biotechnica had resources. Reach. If they wanted her gone, she'd be gone. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. Maybe they'd calculated that killing her would generate more problems than it solved. Maybe they decided she wasn't worth the resources. Maybe they were just biding their time. Maria didn't know. Didn't care. She'd done what she set out to do. Marcus's death had meaning now. His story was out there. People knew. 6 weeks after the story broke, Biotechnica announced policy changes. They didn't call it a response to the WNS investigation. Corporate communications never acknowledged external pressure. Instead, they framed it as continuous improvement of worker welfare programs. Section 7 would receive upgraded ventilation systems. Workers would get monthly health screenings. Exposure limits would be re-evaluated in accordance with updated safety science. The voluntary donation program would require enhanced informed consent protocols, including third-party counseling. Kowalski sent Maria the announcement with a brief message. We didn't win, but we didn't lose either. Small victories. Maria read through the policy changes. Corporate language designed to sound meaningful while changing as little as possible. Upgraded ventilation that might reduce exposure by 5%. Health screenings that would document deterioration without preventing it. Enhanced consent protocols that would add paperwork without protecting workers. But it was something. Section 7 would kill fewer workers annually. Maybe only 200 instead of 300. Maybe the deaths would take 8 months instead of 7. Maybe a few people would see through the consent protocols and refuse enrollment. Maybe. Small victories in a war that couldn't be won. Maria thought about Marcus, about his sacrifice, about the system that had ground him into profit margins and corporate quarterly reports. She thought about all the others like him, the millions of people in Night City who existed only as economic units to be exploited until they failed. She couldn't save them, couldn't change the fundamental nature of corporate power, couldn't tear down the system that valued profit over human life, but she could make them see, could force them to acknowledge what they were doing, could make the exploitation uncomfortable enough that they'd hide it better, regulate it slightly, implement policies that saved a few lives, even while condemning thousands more. It wasn't justice, wasn't even close, but it was what she had. 3 months after Marcus's death, Maria received a message from an anonymous account. No identifying information, no trace data, just a brief text. Your brother's kidney is functioning well. The recipient wants you to know he's grateful. She stared at the message for a long time. Whoever received Marcus's kidney, probably the Arasaka executive, probably someone with platinum-tier insurance who'd never wanted for anything. They knew somehow, had tracked down where the organ came from, had found Maria despite her attempts to disappear, and they'd sent gratitude, like it was a gift, like Marcus had chosen to die so some corpo could live, like the system that had killed her brother was somehow benevolent. Maria deleted the message without responding, but she kept fighting. She volunteered at free clinics in Kabuki, helped scav victims navigate the predatory medical debt system, connected desperate workers with the few remaining labor advocates who tried to protect them, documented cases of corporate exploitation, and fed information to journalists willing to risk their careers. Small actions, insufficient actions, drops of water against the ocean. But she kept going, because the alternative was accepting that Marcus had died for nothing, that the system was immutable, that resistance was pointless, and Maria refused to accept that. Years passed. The story faded from public consciousness. New scandals emerged. New atrocities demanded attention. Biotechnica's voluntary donation program continued with minor modifications. Section 7 kept processing workers. The algorithms in Arasaka Tower kept calculating human worth. Trauma Team kept prioritizing platinum clients while silver-tier patients bled out. Night City continued functioning exactly as designed. But Maria remembered, and she made sure others remembered too. She collected stories, built a database of victims, created memorials that existed in hidden corners of the net where corporate scrubbers couldn't easily reach. Marcus Chen's story was there, along with thousands of others. A record of all the people the Megacorps had decided weren't worth saving. The people who mattered. On the 5th anniversary of Marcus's death, Maria returned to Watson District, to the alley where Trauma Team had left him to die. The location was unremarkable. Just another stretch of stained concrete between corporate buildings. Trash accumulated in the corners. Advertisements flickered on every surface. People walked past without looking down, without acknowledging that someone had bled out here while medical professionals decided he wasn't worth their time. Maria placed a small memorial. Nothing elaborate. Just a metal plate with Marcus's name etched into it. The plate would probably be stolen or removed within days. Corporate security didn't allow unauthorized installations on their property. But for now, it was there. Proof that Marcus Chen had existed, had mattered, had been more than just an economic calculation that didn't balance. Maria stood there as rain began to fall. Neon-stained water that tasted like chemicals and smelled like industry. The same rain that had been falling the night Marcus died. The same rain that fell every night in Watson, washing away blood and hope and evidence that anything terrible had happened at all. Above her, an advertisement display flickered. Trauma Team's logo, glowing in white and red. 7 minutes or your money back, the slogan promised. Because every life matters. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Maria pulled her coat tighter and walked away from the alley. Away from the memorial that wouldn't last. Away from the place where her brother had been left to die so a corpo could be saved. She had work to do. People to help. Stories to preserve. Small victories to fight for in a war that couldn't be won. Because that's what Marcus would have wanted. Not revenge, not justice. Just the simple, desperate hope that maybe, someday, enough small victories would add up to something that mattered. That maybe eventually the system that had killed him would be forced to change. It was a fool's hope, an impossible dream. But Maria chose to believe it anyway, because the alternative was surrender, was accepting that the megacorporations had won completely and forever, was admitting that human life truly had no value beyond economic calculation, and she refused to give them that. Somewhere in Arasaka Tower, the algorithms continued their eternal work, measuring, calculating, deciding who deserved to live and who could be allowed to die. The system functioned with perfect efficiency, converting human suffering into corporate profit with mathematical precision. But the algorithms couldn't measure everything, couldn't quantify hope or resistance or the stubborn human refusal to accept injustice, couldn't calculate the value of memory, couldn't factor in the weight of a sister's grief transformed into determination. The system was powerful, vast, nearly omnipotent, but it wasn't inevitable. And as long as people like Maria kept fighting, kept remembering, kept documenting and resisting and refusing to accept the calculus of corporate death, there was a chance, however small, however distant, that things could change. Marcus Chen had died believing his death would help his sister. And in a way, it had. Not with money. Money never solved anything in Night City, but with purpose, with clarity, with the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, even when victory seemed impossible. That was his legacy, not the organs harvested and sold, not the profit margins in Biotechnica's quarterly reports, not the algorithm's final calculation of his worth. His legacy was resistance, was the refusal to accept that corporate arithmetic defined human value, was the choice to keep fighting even when the system seemed unbeatable. And that legacy would outlast the corporations that killed him. It had to, because if it didn't, if resistance was futile and memory was meaningless and the system truly couldn't be changed, then Night City had already won, and everyone was already dead. They just hadn't stopped moving yet.